Jason loved to read. Every day he would take a walk to a nice place, like the park or the beach, and sit down to read for hours. It didn't matter what the story was about or who the author was, because Jason just loved to read. One weekend, his usual places were a little crowded due to the gorgeous weather. He decided to walk in the woods to see if he could find a clearing, or an interesting log, where he could relax and lose himself in a book. Jason walked through the forest for quite some time. These particular woods weren't good for hiking, and it had no trails, and he was for sure to have some solitude. He wasn't sure how far he had walked before he came across the mysterious building. It looked somewhat of an old bank, and it was covered in moss and vines. The doors were open and falling off the hinges. The windows were filthy and broken. Jason figured this strangely placed building might be just what he was looking for. As he entered through the crumbling doorway, he saw dozens of shelves lined with books. What was the library was doing in the middle of the woods? It didn't matter to Jason. All that mattered was that he was staring at what might possibly be a treasure trove from the unread narratives. He was wasting no time grabbing a random book from the closest shelf. He dropped from the book bag without a care for its contents. Jason inspected the book, and surely there was something he had never heard of. He returned it to the shelf and went further to investigate the library. The whole place was filthy, but there wasn't any random cutler like that one would expect from an abandoned building. But why was it abandoned? Who could have just left all those books to rot? Jason only thought about it for a moment, as he was too engaged in reading the names of all the books, wondering if he could find something he recognized. He didn't find anything remotely familiar. The books were meant to be read, and Jason felt like those books weren't fulfilling their purpose, and for a long time it seems it was time to start reading. He picked up a book called Black Wing Adventures and sat Indian style on the floor. The book was incredible. It had everything anyone could imagine and want in a good book: adventure, romance, action, and philosophy. But there wasn't just as many good qualities, as those qualities shined much brighter than anything it ever had. If this book was amazing, what treasures did the other books hold? Jason was excited in a way he never felt before. It was getting late, and Jason knew that his girlfriend Melissa would be pissed if he wasn't answering her texts. Normally she understood that this is Jason's me time, but he usually comes home hours ago. He took the book with him so he could finish it later and started his journey home. He wasn't sure if he would find the library again, so he marked the trees along the way with the Sharpie he had in his book bag. Jason got up a bit early the next morning so he can read. He grabbed the book bag and took out what expected to be Black Wing Adventures, but the book now had a different title: Love Without a Friend. More rummaging through the bag produced by his other boring books that he had previously been excited to read. Did he grab the wrong book? No, that wasn't possible. He hadn't let go of the book before putting it in his bag. It was obviously from the same library because it was covered in thick dust. He must have taken the wrong book. It was the only explanation. He decided that he would read Love Without a Friend, even though the title didn't seem anywhere near as cool as the Black Winged Adventures boy. Was he wrong? It was just as good. It didn't have the adventure and action, but it had strikingly humanly quality to it. Jason never felt that any kind of emotions of the story was invoking. Turning each page was like a Christmas present. He couldn't wait to achieve each word, each thought, each feeling. It was late, and Jason began to nod off. He didn't want to stop reading, but eventually passed out. The next morning he was still looking at the book in his hands. He still opened it to the page that he left on, and when he started to read again, he had no idea what he was reading. The story had completely changed. There were different characters, different thoughts, different feelings. He closed the book and looked back at the title. It was Men and Monsters. Jason was even more shocked than the first time. This book didn't left his hands. He had returned to the library to exchange for another book. None of this was possible, and Jason was getting understandably freaked out. As he could think of doing was going back to the library. Maybe he could find one of the other books that he was reading. Upon his arrival, Jason received a text message from Melissa that read, "Are you ignoring me?" He responded telling her that he had found a new spot in the woods to read, and he left out that part of the mysterious library for curious books. Figuring it could be only led to more questions, once Melissa's concern had diminished, Jason shut off his phone. When he got inside the library, he researched long and hard for the Black Wing Adventures, or Love Without a Friend, but he was unsuccessful. In fact, one of these titles reminded him of before where any of these were found. Every book was different. Could this be another abandoned library? How could there many possibly be? Even if everyone seemed strange, Jason wanted to explore and experience what those books were capable of. He didn't want to think of how strange the whole situation had become. He just wanted to read. He knew that he didn't have much time, so he quickly grabbed a book called Our Nation's Last Hero. It was political drama with many twisted turns and as a great mystery. Jason had never read anything like it. He rarely thought about politics, but it was suddenly the most interesting subject in the world. It started to get dark, so once again, Jason left the library and took the book that he had been reading. He hoped it would still be the same book when he woke up the next morning. Unfortunately, it wasn't. Jason didn't know what to do. These books were amazing, but apparently he wasn't going to be able to finish this one unless he read it for less than 24 hours. He was going to have to stay awake for a long time, so he placed his book with some caffeine energy drinks and a few deli sandwiches in case if he got hungry. Jason knew that Melissa would be looking for him, but he didn't care. So he cared a little, so he left his phone at home on purpose. And so it began. Jason was on a mission to finish one of the magical changing books. What else could there be magical? A book that changes every day? What an incredible thing! Although Jason had been upset about not being able to finish the first one. He was thrilled about the fact that he was reading the books no one else would ever read. If he manages to finish one, he'd be satisfied as he could ever be in his whole life. He chose to look at the book called The Lion's Tears and began reading. As he read, he would periodically take a few swigs of his drink and take a bite of his sandwich. Eventually he ran out of drinks and began crashing from all the caffeine. It was too soon. He hadn't finished the book. There were still a few chapters left, but he couldn't stay awake any longer. He hoped that he would wake up again before the book changed. When he awoke, it seemed that the next day had not yet come, but the book had still transformed into something new. Jason decided that he was wrong about when it changed occurred. It wasn't until the next day came, when it felt like forever since he fell asleep. Jason stopped leaving the library. He had no time to walk back and forth or spend time with his girlfriend or do anything rather than the magical books. He tried to stay awake long enough to finish one, but it was no use. He kept falling asleep. Jason was getting angry now. He wasn't so in the treasure trove beautiful works of fiction. It was a curse. He was obsessed with finishing one of the books, and it was eating away at his sanity. No food or water or contact with other human beings. When Jason began to fall asleep, he would take a piece of broken glass from one of the windows and cut himself to stay awake. After several cuts, he began to feel weak from blood loss. His mind was becoming warped and sucked away every word of his now crippled consciousness. The book he chose became more and more macabre. Titles like Making to a Murder Love and then The Man Who Ate Himself were overtaking another, more gentle ones. If Jason was going to finish one of these books, it had to be something that interested him. His gentle themes were no longer in his interest. There was no telling how long Jason had been in the library. He wasn't eating or drinking, but somehow he wasn't hungry or thirsty anymore, as if the books were keeping him alive. They wanted him to do his read, and they wanted him to finish. He kept on getting closer and closer to finishing one of the books. He was sleeping less and less, and his dream was going to soon become true. But which book were the lucky one? Which book would it be one he was going to read from front to back like a willing participant? He picked up a book off of the shelf and looked at a little title. It was called Jason Loved to Read. His eyes widened. His mind raced. What an amazing coincidence! A book with his name in the title. It was someone who loves to read. Adrenaline rushed through Jason's body, and he opened up the book and began to read the first chapter. He read a teenage boy who found an abandoned library in the woods, and he read about books that magically changed their content whenever the protagonist fell asleep. He read about himself. This was the book that he wished he would finish. This was the book he had to finish. Jason's heart pounded like mad as he reached the final chapter, when suddenly was interrupted by a shouting female. "What the hell? Jason? This is where you've been? I've been calling, I've been texting. Everyone's looking for you. I only found this place because I happened to see one of those marks on the trees. I thought that maybe you made them? Hello? Jason? Are you deaf?" Just then she noticed the cuts all over Jason's body. She fell silent and took a step back. There were her boyfriend cut up and bloodied, buried in a book, paying no attention to her trade. "Jason, what's going on? Are you all right? Why won't you look at me? Jason?" Her voice was concerned but hesitant. Jason just sat there Indian style reading his book. Melissa lost her temper. "Look at me, Jason. What the fuck?" She began to cry. All she wanted her to find her boyfriend and discover why he went missing. She expected him to cry in her embrace and tell her that they were together again and that everything was going to be okay. She ran to him and she bent down, grabbed his arm and shouted, "Jason!" For a split second, Jason grabbed a piece of broken glass, already covered in blood from using it to cut himself, and jammed it firmly into Melissa's neck. Her eyes became wild with fear as she gargled and jiggled, eventually falling to the floor with the glass still in her neck. Jason's face had no expression as he continued to read his book, his legacy. It was about to happen. The last page, Jason couldn't believe it. He had finally stayed awake long enough to finish one of the magical books from the mysterious abandoned library in the middle of the woods. His hands shook as he turned the page and saw the words, "The End," towards the bottom. Below the final paragraphs, it was then he became horrified for the first time in his life. The book had ended with the protagonist, Jason, stabbing his girlfriend in the neck with a shard of the broken glass. Jason didn't move, didn't blink, or even think. He just sat there in absolute shock. This was happening. Why did the book say that he killed his girlfriend? That was impossible. Jason was no killer. He just loved to read. He stood up and screamed a desperate, primal scream, throwing the book onto the floor next to Melissa's body. He had turned her as if to noticing her for the first time. There was blood all over the floor. Melissa was surely dead, and Jason must have been the murderer. He left home in a daze and called 911 to turn himself in. According to Jason's story, the police expected to find Melissa's body in the abandoned building in the woods. When they arrived at the proper location, they only found her corpse amid the blood-stained leaves and branches. Nothing that resembled that the library was in sight. The ideas of trial conviction wasn't extraordinary, but what you may find interesting is what happened to Jason when he arrived at prison. His cellmate offered him a book to pass the time. Jason politely replied, "No thanks. I hate to read."